Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Melissa Deckman. I'm the CEO of Public Religion Research Institute. We are delighted to be welcoming you today to talk about the new findings from our latest report, Christian Nationalism Across All 50 States, Insight from PRI's 2024 American Values Atlas. As if you're here, you likely know that this is something that we study pretty routinely at PRI. This is a third national level report that we're issuing today, a survey report. And so we're really excited to kind of dive into the details. Along with Robbie Jones and myself, I'd like to welcome Sam Perry and Erica Ramirez, two very distinguished scholars to talk about our findings. Sam is an award-winning scholar and teacher and among the nation's leading experts on conservative Christianity and American politics, race, families, and sexual behavior. He's been recognized as one of the top sociologists in the world in terms of research productivity and impact, along with well over 100 peer-reviewed articles published in leading academic journals. Dr. Perry is also the author or co-author of 5 books, including Growing God's Family, Addicted to Lust, Taking America Back for God, and The Flag and the Cross. And his most recent book is entitled Religion for Realists: Why We All Need the Scientific Study of Religion. I'm also delighted to be welcoming Dr. Erica Ramirez, who is currently an VTE and fellowships consultant at the Louisville Institute. I'm sorry, she's also, but now she is, of course, now full-time at Louisville Institute. Apologies for that, Erica. I just did not correct that in my notes. Previously, she was the Richard B. Parker Assistant Professor of Wesleyan Thought at Portland Seminary in Oregon, and she holds a Ph.D. in Sociology of Religion from Drew University. She has interest in religion, contemporary politics, and culture, and she's particularly interested in how radical religious traditions present as a challenge to and resource against social oppression, and has written much about evangelicals and Latinos in American politics. So I'm delighted to hear what she has to say with respect to our findings. I want to turn now, of course, to Dr. Robert Jones. He's the president and founder of PRI. Robbie's going to be presenting the findings from our new research report. And as a way of a background, you probably are very familiar with his work, but just a really quick summary. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future, as well as White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, which won a 2021 American Book Award. And he's also the author of The End of White Christian America, which won the 2019 Grawemeyer Award in Religion. And he writes a weekly newsletter for those dedicated to the work of truth-telling, repair, and healing from the legacy of white supremacy in American Christianity at White Too Long. So please make sure to check out his Substack, White Too Long there. And just really quickly, the overview of the program, Robbie's going to present findings. We'll have some commentary, and then I'm going to go to the questions that you asked for us today. So in the Q&A box, please submit your questions, and if we have time, we'll get to those questions and see what our panelists have to say about that. Robbie, I'm going to hand it off to you. Take it away.
Great. Well, thank you, Melissa, and Dr. Perry, Dr. Ramirez. I'm so glad to be with you both again. Longtime colleagues, friends, and we're looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today. So my job is really to set the table with a high-level overview of the main findings of the report today. So I'm going to go through some slides. I'm going to share my screen, go through some slides that will just, again, it's going to be like the 30,000-foot flyover. I do want to say that there is much, much more here at PRI's website at prri.org. It's right there on the homepage. You can just click through. So if you want to see the entire report with lots more than I'm going to be able to share and that we'll be able to talk about today, please go there. So with that, let me jump in here and take you to the findings. So this survey is a very, very large survey that is compiled from data that we collected across all of last year. It's made up of over 22,000 interviews, random probability interviews, who are part of Ipsos Knowledge Panel. That's a random probability sample here conducted between March 13th and December 2nd of last year. Because of the large sample size, the margin of error for the full sample is less than 1 percentage point, plus or minus. And we do want to thank very much the generous support of Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Foundation to Promote Open Society, the Wilbur and Hilda Glenn Family Foundation, and the Unitarian Universalist Veach program at Shelter Rock. So with that, let me jump in. Just to bring everybody up to speed here, we base our scale of Christian nationalism on 5 questions here. I do want to give a shout out to Sam Perry here and his colleague Andrew Whitehead, done some of the kind of early groundbreaking work on measuring how to measure Christian nationalism, and so we are standing on their shoulders with this survey here. And so we have 5 questions here. I won't read them all, but you can get a sense of it. These questions are generally about kind of dominion, like and whether U.S. government should be, declare itself a Christian nation, whether being Christians truly part of being Christians truly part of being truly American, laws should be based on Christian values, etc. And then we asked everyone this, and we essentially created a composite scale out of these 5 different questions, and then we categorize folks based on how they answered those questions into 4 categories here. So these are our names for these categories on the left: adherents, sympathizers, skeptics, and rejectors. And essentially what this means is that you get classified, respondents get classified to be a Christian nationalism adherent if they completely agree on nearly all 5 of those questions. In other words, so it can't just be one question they answer one way, but it has to be very, very consistent and very, very strong answers on all 5 of those questions. Christian nationalism sympathizers are those who agree with those 5 questions, but are less likely than adherents to completely agree with those statements. And then skeptics and adherents are the same, but on the other side. So skeptics are those who disagree, but less likely than the rejectors to completely disagree. And then rejectors are, in fact, those who completely disagree with all 5 questions in the study. So that's the general lay of the land. And when we use that scale, here's what we come up with in the general population. We find essentially about 3 in 10 Americans who are in the categories who are sympathetic or adherents of Christian nationalism. So 1 in 10 adherents. Again, these are people who completely agree with nearly all 5 of those questions. Sympathizers, those who agree but not so strongly. That's about 3 in 10. And then about twice as many of the country are either skeptics or rejectors. So 37% of the country were skeptics who disagree, but not strongly. And then 29% who rejectors who reject all 5 of those questions. So the basic story is that Americans as a whole reject this view by a margin of 2 to 1. However, these views are not evenly distributed across the country, across different subgroups, and we'll see why this attitude, this ideology has had significant impact in the country by how it's distributed. One other thing I should say is we don't see a lot of variation. Using these questions, we began measuring this at the end of 2022. It's remained fairly stable across that time, a little bit up and down, but for the most part, fairly stable across that time. What does this look like at the state level? One of the unique things that we have in this study, because we have such a large sample size, is that we actually have statistically significant findings in all 50 states. So here is the map. Now, this heat map might look a little bit familiar. The patterns here might look a little bit familiar. In fact, if I didn't tell you what this was, you would probably think it looks a lot like the red and blue electoral map that we've all been staring at way too much over the last few months. And there's a reason for that. These views are highly, highly correlated with votes for Republicans and Democrats, and particularly votes for Donald Trump in the last election cycle. So these are the groups. You'll see that the heaviest concentration of state residents who affirm Christian nationalist beliefs, and these are combining adherents and sympathizers, those lean toward supporting Christian nationalism, that we get about half of those in Oklahoma, that's you, Sam, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, that's my home state there, and West Virginia are the states that are right at 50%, or in the case of Mississippi, Oklahoma, just right across a little bit into majority territory, slim majority territory as well. But generally, it's that kind of Midwest sweep down through the South and up the Appalachian Mountains that is the strongest swath of support for Christian nationalism in the country. So just to kind of put this in a little more graphical form, you can really see the correlation between red states, blue states, and battleground states. These are states that were classified that way in the last 2024 election cycle. And you can see that red states are significantly more likely than blue states, for example, to have significant more numbers of adherents or sympathizers. States right there in between. There's the other side of it. So you can see the rejectors and skeptics on the other side for each of these categories of states. Now, this one I think is quite significant. I've kind of joked that if you were when we saw this, I was quite shocked for the first time how tight this correlation was. In fact, I said, we could actually use this in a statistics textbook to kind of look at, what a scatter plot that shows a kind of strong positive linear correlation looks like. It's really, really tight. The dots are not spread out. So the x-axis here, we have scores on the Christian nationalism scale. The y-axis, we have percent vote for Trump in 2024. And as you can see, it is highly, highly correlated. Very, very easy to draw a linear trend line through that. And then, those states that I mentioned earlier with the highest scores, Mississippi, Louisiana, you can look in that upper right-hand quadrant there, and they're right there, not only showing the highest scores on the Christian nationalism scale, but the highest likelihood of support for Donald Trump in 2024. So let's take a look at which groups are most likely. You'll still see some reiteration of this to support Christian nationalism. If we look at, again, at those top two categories, adherents and sympathizers, you'll see there are strong, strong partisan differences here, with independents looking a lot more like Democrats than Republicans. Often in political science or sociology, we talk about this as asymmetric polarization. That is, that kind of one side of the divide looks far different than the middle and the other side. And that's the case here with Republicans. It's a majority, 53% of Republicans who qualify as either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. To go back to the earlier point I was making, it's only 3 in 10, as you can see here in the All-Americans number, that support Christian nationalism. But among one of our two political parties, it has become a majority outlook, a majority worldview here. And that's one of the reasons why we're seeing it have such a disproportionate effect in the country, is because it gets amplified through one of our two political parties. Also, we see here very, very strong correlations between television media consumption. So our question asks, who do you most trust to give you accurate information about current events and politics among television news outlets? So far right television news here in our survey are things like One American News, Newsmax, et cetera, the kind of group of outlets that have kind of grown up to the right of Fox News. You can see they have the most outsized influence. In fact, 2/3 of people who say they must trust those far right news outlets say they are either Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers. And Fox News here as well, has a strong outlet. And you can see it looks very, very different for folks who say they don't really watch television news, or they trust any other kind of mainstream television news outlet. And there's the other side you can see as well, with rejectors and skeptics thrown in. Across the religious landscape, we see also a big spread here, with two groups that really stand out at the top. White evangelical Protestants and Hispanic Protestants are the two groups in majority territory, with either have majority adherents or sympathizers. White evangelical is really the group that is most out there. It's about 2/3 of that group that is either adherents or sympathizers. Latino Protestants, also in majority territory, 57% saying they adhere to or qualify as adherents or sympathizers here. Notably, both of these groups voted strong majority for Trump. White evangelical Protestants more than 8 in 10. Latino Protestants about 6 in 10 support for President Trump as well. And then you can see it starts falling off after that. African American Protestants, we could talk about this a little bit later, are the group that scores a little higher, not to majority territory, but it is above 40%. There, along with Latter-day Saints, and then it drops off considerably from there. You can see groups, the unaffiliated Muslims, other non-Christian groups, very, very low on these measures, as are Unitarian Universalists as well. And then here's the other side, where you can see the other side of this. The other thing we found is that we found a strong positive correlation between church attendance and adherence to Christian nationalist views. So, in fact, we look at it's fairly linear. Among those who attend religious services once a week or more, it is right about half. Who qualify as either adherents or sympathizers, and then it just stair steps down. The less you attend religious services, the less likely you are to qualify as a Christian nationalism adherent or a sympathizer. So, in other words, this is not sort of Christians in name only who aren't connected really with churches. These are, in fact, Christians who are connected with churches there. The other thing we did is take a look at a few attitudinal measures to kind of round this out. So we asked a question in our post-election survey about whether or not God ordained Trump to be the winner of the 2024 election. Not surprisingly, there's also a fairly linear, strong correlated relationship between Christian nationalism and this belief. So in fact, those who are the strongest Christian nationalism adherents, 2/3 of them agree that God ordained Trump to be the winner of the 2020 election, about half of sympathizers, and then it really drops down to only about 1 in 5 skeptics and very, very few rejectors as well. And then one of the things we know also is that this is something that Sam's work has consistently shown as well, is that anti-immigrant sentiments are very, very strongly connected with Christian nationalism here. So here are two statements that are fairly extreme, actually. So one of them is a kind of proxy for the kind of racist great replacement theory that immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. The other one is actually a statement that has straight up Nazi sentiments around it. Immigrants are entering the country illegally, who are entering the country illegally today are poisoning the blood of our country. Now, only a little more than 1/3 of all Americans agree with either one of these statements. But as you can see, those who affirm Christian nationalist views are about twice as likely, are nearly twice as likely as the public to strongly affirm these views. And you can see it really drop off among those who are either skeptical or reject Christian nationalist views. Don't look like that at all, but you can see the strong correlation here between these kind of strong anti-immigrant sentiments and support for Christian nationalism as well. Melissa will talk about this, I think, some more as well, but gender attitudes, particularly for patriarchal gender roles. Here are two statements. Society as a whole has become too soft and feminine, and society is better off when men and women stick to the jobs and tasks they're naturally suited for. These are agree, disagree questions. A little more than 1/3 on the second one. About 4 in 10 Americans agree with these statements. But again, you'll see the strong correlation between affirming Christian nationalist views and affirming these views about these patriarchal views as well here. And then it drops off very significantly among those who are less supportive of Christian nationalism. One other one. Say we had here is about whether it's kind of about anti-Black discrimination and particularly denials that any past discrimination has any effect in the present. So this is a question that says generations of slavery and discrimination against Black people and Native Americans have given white people unfair economic advantages. And here again, you see particularly and these are the folks that agree with these statements. Versus those who disagree with those statements here, that the rejectors are the ones most likely to agree with the existence of systemic racism. Skeptics, a little less likely so, actually, but then the sympathizers and adherents far less likely to agree that there are these current results from past discrimination still at play today. Here are two that I think are kind of maybe alarm bell questions. One of these is a question is actually part of a QAnon battery that we've been asking for quite a while, but it's an agree-disagree question about a sense of apocalyptic revolution. It says there's a storm coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders. And then the other one is about support for political violence because things have gotten so far off track. true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. On both of these questions, Christian nationalist views are strongly associated with affirmation of these. So if you look on the left, we see adherents and sympathizers much more likely to affirm this sense of apocalyptic revolution that's coming. Also, much more likely, in the case of adherents, in both cases, twice as likely as the American public to believe both of these statements, and then much lower agreement among skeptics and rejectors on both of these questions. And so I will go back to the state level thing here to show, particularly on support for political violence. This is not just something at the national level, but it actually shows up all the way down at the state level. So this is similar to the one I showed you before with Trump support on the y-axis. But in this case, we've got those who agree that political violence may be justified in order to save the country. That's the y-axis. And then average score on the Christian nationalism scale on the x-axis here. And again, you can see this sorting of states. And I'm going to show you, this is among all Americans. And I'm going to show you one in the next slide that just restricts the analysis to white Americans. And what you see is actually, particularly on political violence, that the correlation actually gets tighter when we're looking only at white Americans. You can look, for example, at like my home state of Mississippi. You'll kind of watch that one. It's on the kind of lower right here. And I'm going to kind of toggle over. So this is all Americans, this kind of tight correlation here between Christian nationalism and support for Christian violence, support for political violence at the state level. Here it is among white Americans. So if you look at sort of Mississippi and watch it kind of move, so it kind of moves up and right. So in states with kind of higher levels of non-white citizens tend to do that. And Louisiana also kind of moves right and up, Arkansas slightly as well. And the correlation just gets a little bit tighter when we restrict it just to white Americans here. And with that, I am going to land the plane here and turn it back over to Melissa and comments from our panelists.
Thank you, Robbie, so much for that terrific presentation. Again, I'd remind our viewers to go online to our website. There's much more data and analysis from our report. But again, I'm delighted now to be turning to our guest speakers. Just one quick reminder, our Q&A function is open, so please send us your questions that we hope to get to by the end of today's webinar. So first, I'm going to turn to Sam for his thoughts, and then we'll go to Erica. So Sam, please take it away.
Thanks. You know, I want to start by just saying how grateful I am for PRRI in general and what they do. PRRI has been providing access to data for the last several years. I mean, it's been truly a boon for social scientists like myself who we build our efforts on survey data and things that are made available and things that we can collect, but also the great questions and data sets that PRRI provides for us with their great questions. And so after a time of embargo, these things get made public. And so we're all just really grateful for that access. And it benefits all of us, really, who want to know more about these things. I also want to stress, I think, what an advance the questions that PRRI has been asking about Christian nationalism. So as Robbie said at the beginning of his presentation, my colleagues and I have been trying to study Christian nationalism for about 10 years now. And we were using previous sets of questions that I think worked fine, but I think like social science needs to advance, and we're always looking for better measurement and better ways to capture constructs and ideas like Christian nationalism to try to zero in on what exactly it is we're measuring. And I think PRRI has done an excellent job. These 5 questions that they're using consistently across these studies since 2022 have been excellent. I think they have what we call high face validity. People read those and they say, yes, that sounds like exactly what I would expect somebody who believes this kind of ideology would say or affirm. They hang together really nicely. People who agree with some one or two of those questions usually agree with the others. They correlate really strongly together. And so it's gotten to the point where I get asked maybe once every 3 weeks, somebody's doing a survey and they say, hey, what questions should I include on my survey to capture Christian nationalism? And I always tell them now, you can't do much better than what PRRI is putting on there. So use their 5 questions, and those have been really helpful. So I think the report itself and the data that are building that it's building from are a real benefit for a variety of reasons. Let's talk about the 2024 election. So in the 2024 election, we looked at all of these exit polls, and a lot of people came to the conclusion that, you know what, this was not a culture war kind of election. It wasn't one that Christian nationalist rhetoric certainly played a part leading up to it, but when it came to how people voted, it looked like they were going on economic vibes, dissatisfaction with the economy, inflation, cost of living, and a good portion of concern about chaos at the border, or safety or crime or those kinds of things. And I think the findings of this PRRI report really reveal that Christian nationalism, I think, plays a more important role than exit polls would likely have shown for a variety of reasons. So, for example, PRRI in this report demonstrate, and Robbie talked about this, how Christian nationalist ideology is correlated strongly with the perception, specifically especially among white Americans, that immigrants, not just undocumented immigrants, but immigrants are invading. They are replacing our ethnic and cultural heritage. And that was a big part of the rhetoric that was used, this ideology of replacement. It wasn't necessarily used, replacement phrasing wasn't necessarily used by prominent politicians, but it's certainly prominent among the right-wing media. And lo and behold, we find in the report that adherents of Christian nationalism were more likely to consume far-right media. They're more likely to be tapped into OAN and Newsmax and Fox News and to watch the kind of television that would have told them you're being replaced, immigrants are invading, and especially undocumented immigrants. The question about poisoning the blood, like Robbie said, I think is quite alarming. The fact that a third of Americans affirm that at all, but high percentages of adherents and sympathizers agree to that is pretty shocking. Now, because I'm a social scientist, I couldn't help myself, and so what I wanted to do is I took the Christian nationalism scores because I was curious what percentage of this kind of fear of being replaced and replacement ideology really corresponds to somebody's actual exposure to immigrants. And so I took the percentage. I won't show this, but I took the percentage of states that was provided by PRRI who are adherents and sympathizers of Christian nationalism, and I looked at the percentage of states that are made up of immigrants generally. So what percentage of your state is actually immigrant? And it's actually the opposite correlation. So Christian nationalism is actually stronger in states where there are fewer immigrants, not more. And so the perception that we are being replaced by immigrants is actually the opposite. It is in fact a lack of exposure to immigrants that corresponds to Christian nationalism. It's not the perception that they're everywhere. It really is what you're being told from right-wing media, which I think is pretty powerful. There's another part of the report that I really appreciated, and this is something that Robbie didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about, but I want to elaborate, is this correlation between educational attainment and adherence to Christian nationalism. So I think the wrong conclusion would be because educational attainment is negatively associated with adhering to Christian nationalist ideology. It has been since we started studying this. It's a very consistent finding in all of these reports. And we find that states with higher adherence of Christian nationalism have lower percentages of people who graduate from college and lower on other socioeconomic indicators as well. So I think the wrong conclusion would be to draw that, well, Christian nationalist people or people who adhere to that ideology are just ignorant. I don't think actually that's what it's about. I think this actually sheds light on the results that we saw in the 2024 election. I think the lack of access to education, lack of college level education, lower income. I took the state level data that PRRI provided, and I actually correlated that with other indicators of quality of life and socioeconomic status. And Christian nationalism is higher in states with higher poverty rates, lower life expectancy, higher rates of gun violence, higher rates of incarceration, higher rates of divorce, and all kinds of indicators of quality of life not being great, right? And it's not about ignorance per se. It is about a lack of access or lack of opportunity to achieve the things that you feel like you deserve, right? Like the things that you merit. It is, in other words, an indicator, I think, of a populist backlash to feeling frustrated with one's place in life, feeling like I am not getting access to all these other things that I see, and I'm being told by these media pundits that this is because it's being stolen from me, it's being taken. And so I think the kind of data that PRRI has provided really, especially because it's so big and we can look at it at the state level, I think we're able to draw some really powerful conclusions about what is going on in the broader context within these communities and states. And hopefully one day when we collect enough data on this, we can narrow it down to counties as well, as we're adding up all these kinds of opportunities. And we can draw some conclusions about what is really going on in these locales. But I think it has to do with a populist backlash. And that is actually consistent with what we found in the exit polls about the 2024 election. Christian nationalism is an ideology and a set of beliefs and myths and values and identities that correspond with right-wing backlash and populist kind of push that we have seen in recent years. And I think PRRI's data is absolutely like a slam dunk in that way. So I'd love to answer more questions as we go on, but that's what I have for now. I love the study; it's really helpful.
Thank you, Sam, so much. I think we just lost 1,000 more research projects just hearing you you make your comments there. So thank you for placing that in some broader context. Erica, please, we'd love to hear your thoughts about the study.
First, I'd like to echo Sam's remarks on my gratitude to PRRI for continuing to provide just a bevy of scholars and the public with the kind of landscape analysis that sheds light on, for instance, a very important recent election. So thank you for your comment, Sam. Thank you for the invitation, Robert and Melissa. You know, as a scholar of evangelical and charismatic movements, there's some stories emerging right now in this data that are shaping how I see the populations that I am most committed to understanding as a scholar. And for me, one of the stories that this data is telling is about the resilience of evangelical Protestantism in the American religious landscape. And the two sets of data points that are informing my first takeaway is one about their church participation. So in this latest report, we can see that the Christian nationalist public is a very church-going public, that church participation on a weekly basis increases the likelihood that someone will meet that adherent or sympathizer criteria in your study. So when I look at the resilience of their participation in weekly church life, that's something I'm taking note of. I'm also considering the resilience of their responding to identifying as evangelical Protestants in this survey. And I contextualize that in a setting where since 2016, it is no secret that identifying or sympathizing with evangelical sensibilities has been increasingly stigmatized by legacy media. So when I see the kind of relatively stable identification in this survey of about 23 to 25% of the population still reporting that they're evangelical or evangelical aligned, still attending church or even increasingly attending church on a weekly basis, I'm taking note of that resilience as something that will shape this movement for probably decades to come. I'm also interpreting them based on this data as highly competitive. And this is what I mean. For me, this election was foregrounded in competing accounts about both Donald Trump and the nation. And I think that those things were emanated from 2 or 3 different sites. One, again, the media, but then 2, the social media participation of charismatic and evangelical adherents, and then from their kind of traditional pulpit Sunday morning style discourse emanation, the way that preachers participate in advancing their own accounts of who Trump is and who the nation should be. And I think this election is just a snapshot, right? Elections are not some sort of final end all be all of the discussion, but I think it shows us the willingness of evangelical groups to compete in terms of their accounts of the nation and their accounts of Donald Trump. And then to, at this point in 2024, to have obtained some sway in the general population. I noted, for instance, that the Democratic candidates this past year in their election cycle sounded much more like Donald Trump, sounded much more like evangelical rhetoricians when it came to what is going on at the border. So I think that they are willing and knowledgeable competitors around who's giving what kind of account of what Donald Trump means in the life of the nation. Given that I think that they're both resilient and competitive, they emerge for me in this election cycle as risk-taking. Both experts, Donald Trump, even the parties here would all frame this past election as highly important. I think that something that experts Donald Trump and pastors and preachers have all sounded off as the idea that this election had grave consequences for the future of the nation. So when I'm looking at a population that seems resilient under criticism, competitive in their accounts of the nation, I see that they're willing to take risks at the election, in this election. They're willing to take risks at the ballot box. Because for me, what they're emerging as is people who believe in their own processes of discernment and moral decision making. So, and I think that they know that there are other ways to read this candidate, but they are proving sticky to their own processes of discernment and their own decision making. So that seems risky. And all of this is meaningful in in something that's really high stakes. What emerges is that they have captured enough of the electoral share, and in highly important electorally rich states to make a material difference. So I was looking especially, and I thank you, PRRI, for sharing extra data. I was looking at where, for instance, Hispanic Protestants are shifting toward the right in both Florida and in Texas. And we also see the same thing with Hispanic Catholics in Florida. And what I'm seeing is that this resilient, risk-taking population is also enough of a diverse population because, as we know, evangelical and charismatic groups are already interracial, that these groups are carrying enough influence with Hispanic voters to trouble what has been a long established Democratic Party bet, which is that these voters will vote primarily on their ethnic interest. I think now what's emerging for me in the data is that there is not a Hispanic vote, which we've heard many times before, but I'm thinking in terms of the Cuban American vote, the Venezuelan American vote, the Mexican American vote in Texas, the Mexican American vote in California. And I think all of these groups have their own strong religiosities, but they're showing up very differently in how they understand their interests in the American project. So those are just some initial takeaways. I think what's surprising is how important 1.6, that's what I measured this like Hispanic, evangelical, charismatic or Protestant group vote to really represent 1.6 to 2% of the population in these electorally rich states. But in such tight elections, those 1 to 2% sways really matter. And I think what we're seeing is potentially not only short-term, but very long-term implications. As we know, the replication rate of not only evangelical churches, but also the Hispanic population is set to rise before 2050. So thank you. That'll close my comments for now. I'm seeing a lot here. I'm left with a strong impression of how important 1 to 2% can be.
Thank you both, Erica and Sam, for some really interesting commentary. I'm going to share a few of my thoughts with respect to attitudes about gender and patriarchy that we find in the study, as kind of Robbie already mentioned before. So, you know, one of the things I think about when we think about Christian nationalism is really that it is an ideology that's rooted in very hierarchical thinking. And that also extends, of course, to notions of patriarchy, right? So Christian nationalists would argue that society is better served when we endorse and embrace traditional gender roles. Something that a friend of PRI has talked about, Kristen Dumais, this idea of a militant masculinity, which she really, I think, pretty astutely chronicled in her book, Jesus and John Wayne. And so I think it's really important to think about that relationship between attitudes about gender and Christian nationalism. Now, we don't have this in this report, but in 2023, our first report about Christian nationalism and patriarchy, we asked Americans, do you think that in a truly Christian family, the husband is the head of the household and the wife submits to his leadership? That this is sort of a submissive role that women are to play in Christian households. We found that 7 in 10 adherents agreed with that sort of philosophy. But we also see in the data that Robbie just presented on 2 other questions that really tap into gendered hierarchical thinking, whether society as a whole has become too soft and feminine, or whether society is better off when men and women stick to the jobs and tasks they're suited for. There's a very strong relationship, right? If you are a Christian nationalist adherent, or sympathizer, you're far more likely to agree with those notions here. So why does this all matter now politically? This is something that's not necessarily new, but in our political context, why is it worth examining these two questions? Well, I think, right now, of course, we've just emerged from a presidential campaign in which themes of a militant masculinity, to use the idea that Kristen wrote about, really played a very front seat role in this election, right? And we know my own work in the past and others have shown that attitudes about gender really help to explain people's electoral choices. Whether it's looking at gendered nationalism, which is a kind of a shorthand way of when I think about that soft and feminine question, or concepts known as hegemonic masculinity, which is this idea that men have to be powerful, breadwinning protectors in their families and broader society. And because of that, men have to maintain a dominant social role over women and other groups considered to be feminine. So those themes were really rampant in this election cycle. And a lot of pundits have looked at some trends in the electorate that maybe ran counter to what we expected. For example, looking at young men and how they voted, that maybe this idea of Trump doubling down on masculinity themes as really being the factor for why we saw, for example, a majority of young men voted for the Republican nominee. And this is really the first time in 4 decades that has happened, that a majority of young men have voted for a Republican. So I think in terms of our recent election, it's important to take a closer look at this, but it's not just merely the election, right? We've seen just 2 weeks into this administration, really clear gendered elements, both in terms of policy and in terms of people that have been appointed by the Trump administration. We could spend the rest of the webinar and the afternoon kind of listing individuals, right, who kind of fit this criteria. But just to give you a couple of examples, overnight, we learned that the new acting State Department Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, who, by the way, had been in the Trump administration the first time around and was dismissed because he'd been going to Christian nationalist conferences, right? And so he tweeted out in October, "Competent white men must be in charge if you want things to work." Unfortunately, our entire national ideology is predicated on the feelings of women and minorities and demoralizing competent white men. This was a tweet from 2 months ago. He's now acting at a very high level in the Trump administration. We know that, of course, NSF funding is being scrutinized, right? We've all been watching with whiplash, really, all of the funding mechanisms that have been kind of seized by Elon Musk and by the Trump administration, including grants for National Science Foundation funding. And so overnight, a program officer at the NSF posted a list of keywords that have caused these grants to be pulled and to be scrutinized. And among the list are women and female, the flag words. So if your grant had the words of women or female, you've been flagged for further review. And I think most of us as social scientists would say this is a crisis really for academic freedom and for science here. And then, of course, we can turn to the executive orders that have been emerging with respect to gender. One of Trump's first executive orders, of course, reversed Biden-era protections for transgender individuals in the military. Another early executive order, day one, was to state that it was now the U.S. government policy to recognize 2 sexes, male and female. It elaborated, sex shall not be referred to an individual's immutable biological classification as either male or female. Sex is not a synonym for and does not include the concept of gender identity. And over the weekend, we learned that leading public health agencies appeared to have culled websites to discuss gender, sexually transmitted diseases, and LGBTQ health. So bearing all that in mind, I think the politics right now really demand us to look more closely at how gender plays a role in understanding Christian nationalism. So with that in mind, and knowing I only have a few minutes left, I have 5 quick questions, maybe rapid fire, that I'm going to pull some data from the report that might help us shed some light and help us kind of understand the context in which we're dealing. Okay, first off, are men more likely to be Christian nationalists? You'd expect maybe with this kind of ideology that views women as subordinate, there'd be some serious gender differences. And we find that that is not the case at all, right? There are no gender differences when it comes to support for Christian nationalism. So women are just as likely as men to be classified as Christian nationalists. But then you might ask, Melissa, okay, are there gender differences maybe within groups, kind of getting at this idea that young men perhaps are being drawn to a more conservative worldview? So I had our very talented research team dive into the numbers here. And really, we're not finding, in fact, that young men are being drawn to Christian nationalism anymore than they have over the past couple of years. So among men aged 18 to 29, 10% identify as Christian nationalist adherents, which is the national average. Now, for young women, it's 8%, but that difference is not statistically significant. And so really, no matter what age group, there are no gender differences here. So it's not necessarily the case that we're finding women are rejecting this ideology any more than men are. So what about, however, if we look within Christian nationalism, this kind of circle of the 29% of Americans who are either adherents or sympathizers, are there any gender differences emerging there with respect to gender attitudes? This is something I think we should be playing around with a little bit more. But we find, for example, that 60% of Christian nationalist women agree that society has become too soft and feminine. That's far higher than American women more generally, or far higher than the national average. But interestingly, Christian nationalist men, we find it jumps to 74%. So there is a big sizable and significant gap between Christian nationalist men and women when it comes to attitudes about whether society has become too soft and feminine. And on the question of whether or not society is better off when women and men stick to jobs and tasks they're naturally suited for, we find also a significant gender difference here among Christian nationalists. So 49% of Christian nationalist women agree with that, but it jumps up to 65% of Christian nationalist men, right? So that's a 15% gap, which I think is something we might want to consider playing around with a little bit more to look at gender differences within Christian nationalists themselves. Okay, last two questions. So are Americans becoming more conservative on gender attitudes more generally? And so I had our team go back and look at when we first started asking these two questions that Robbie discussed earlier. Has society become too soft and feminine? Well, in 2016, we found that 42% of Americans agreed with that notion. And lo and behold, just last year, it's 45%. So it's a little bit up, but not really that different. So there hasn't necessarily been this emergence of more conservative views about America being too soft and feminine. What we do see, of course, though, is that much like other areas of public policy or attitudes about politics and society, the partisans have become more polarized here. So in 2016, we found, for example, that 60% of Republicans said America was too soft and feminine. That's risen to 73% most recently, if we look at our most recent data from November. Now, what about this idea that America should be having men and women doing the jobs they're suited for? Again, we're not finding any discernible conservative trend here. In 2016, it was about 39%. It's now 37%, slight decline, but again, not statistically significant and different. But again, we're seeing more polarization among partisans, whereas we see that idea that society would be better off has grown among Republicans from 45% in 2016 to 54%. Now more than half of Republicans say society would be better off here. And we've seen also a decline among Democrats, about a 10-point drop from 30% to 20% here. But what about young men on this measure? My last question that I'm answering here. Have they grown more conservative on these issues? And I think with this, however, we are finding a more conservatizing trend among young men. So in 2016, when we asked this about America being too soft and feminine, it was 42%, but it's actually grown to 57% among young men. And whether society is better off when women and men stick to their jobs that they're naturally suited for, we've seen a 10-point increase from 2016, from 38% to 48%. So I think that's sort of an interesting thing we want to monitor. So my big takeaways when it comes to gender and our study and our data here at PRRI, despite seeing this growing prominence of more conservative, patriarchal views within the GOP and increasingly within some people who are leading, the new Trump administration, we're not finding that Christian nationalism ideology is growing at all, nor are men or women, having differences of opinions when it comes to Christian nationalist ideology. That said, there is evidence demonstrating that while Americans seem to be holding similar views on gender attitudes, we do see a more conservative trend among young men, which I think is going to be something we should be monitoring in the near future. And then last but not least, Christian nationalist women clearly are very conservative, right? Because, we classify as in that they're very religious, all those sorts of things. But even among Christian nationalism, the women hold less patriarchal views than the men. And I think that it really kind of symbolizes that masculinity, themes about gender really are significantly more likely to shape the views of men who are part of this movement. So these are things that I'm going to be thinking about and we're thinking about here at PRRI, but things that I thought were really revealing from the survey. All right, so with that said, why don't we turn to some questions and we'll kind of talk to the panelists here. We've got a lot of questions actually here. All right, so let's start with maybe Robbie, who's kind of, and Sam, who've looked at Christian nationalism, I think, over time. Do you think that we're seeing any sort of changes with respect to the worldview of right-wing adherents? Like, are we becoming more solidified when it comes to Christian nationalism? And relatedly, you know, well, actually, this will be a second question, though, but let's kind of take a look at that. What do you think has sparked the rise of Christian nationalism in the last couple of years as a political movement? So kind of combining two questions there. One listener said, I just don't remember hearing about this group 5 to 10 years ago. So Robbie and then to Sam.
Oh, sorry, Sam. I was going to go ahead. I'll jump in after you.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. One, I think there's been several studies now that have demonstrated that Christian nationalist ideology, it doesn't move a whole lot, but it like, when we try to make it respond to various kinds of experimental primes and things like that, like it's a pretty stable ideology, but what it does respond to is it responds to perceptions of threat. And so in various experimental studies, psychologists and political scientists have shown that when you tell a group of, say, white Christians or Christians that they're demographically declining or they're going to be replaced by seculars or those kinds of things, they actually respond with greater Christian nationalism. And so it seems to be kind of a circling the wagons ideology that says, like, hey, when I perceive threat, then I need to be reminded, we need to reinforce who this nation actually belongs to. In our book, The Flag and the Cross, we trace Christian nationalist ideology throughout history, and it seems to be, it arises and falls in response to different enemies, different outgroups, different outsiders. And so I think at this moment, when a particular group of people, like, conservative, like as Robbie was writing the end of white Christian America, I mean, I think people really felt that. They really felt after 2 straight losses to Obama and his leftist agenda, I think, you had a bunch of, I think white Christian kind of ethno-culture within the United States, a combination of feeling like they had been left behind. I mean, you've got the rhetoric, or not the rhetoric, the reality of Arlie Hochschild, strangers in their own land, right? This perception that I'm being cut in line, right? Like by all of these outsiders who are taking what is mine. And you had a right-wing media ecosystem that has been ready to kind of say, like, no, this nation rightfully belongs to you, it is yours. So I think that amplifies Christian nationalist ideology, or at least the salience of that kind of belief in that rhetoric. I also think there has been some, and we're seeing people own the label now, Christian nationalism, and that is a response to the popularity of the terms, kind of a basket of deplorables move, where people are saying, hey, let's turn it into a positive thing and let's just call ourselves that. And so that part of it comes from us having these conversations. And we still need to have these conversations, but I think there's some measure people owning the label as a response to, like, oh, okay, this is something that people don't like. Well, we're going to double down on this and claim it even more. Robbie, what do you think about that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that one of the reasons why it's become two things. One, in many ways, this is sort of a reorganization of the old Christian right? So it's not new. I mean, and if you go back further, it's a reorganization of a tradition. My last book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, I went back to 1493, right, to trace the roots of this through the doctrine of discovery and the idea that the U.S., that was all wrapped up in manifest destiny, right, that this was a country that was intended by God to be a promised land for European Christians. Or that's got, so you mentioned, Sam, it is, and I think that's the power of it. It has always been an ethno-religious claim to dominance, right? So it's whiteness plus Christianity, right, and a kind of hierarchical worldview with white Christians on top and white Christian men on top, right? It's got gendered as well. And so that it's been with us for a long time. So why has it come to have this militant edge to it, I think, and I think it's what Sam said, is because the number of white Christians are in fact falling in the country. So, when I wrote The End of White Christian America, that was 2016, I was marking for the first time that we went from a country that was a majority white Christian. As recently as 2008, the country was a majority white Christian country. Today, we're 41%. white and Christian. If you take all white Christians together, it's 41%. And so that's a fairly quick move. Just from like 2008, it was 54. Today it's 41. That's a pretty quick move. And if you look at evangelicals, they've dropped if you look at white non-Hispanic evangelicals, they've dropped from being nearly a quarter of the country to being 13% of the country today. So that's a steep decline. And I think it is that threat that you mentioned, Sam, that is kind of motivating this, basically it's a sort of, I think in some ways a very cynical giving up on democracy.
That's
Right. When the numbers aren't there and you realize you can't achieve your ends with democratic means, there is a reach then for extra democratic means to kind of achieve those goals. And I think that's a lot of what we're seeing.
That's right.
Thank you. I have a question actually for Erica. One participant asked here, do you feel that the legacy media tried the theory of militant or toxic masculinity to discredit the Hispanic vote for Donald Trump? That's a very specific question, but I'm kind of more curious as to, there's been lots of writing or lots of thinking about why Latinos, especially Latino men, broke harder for Trump this election. So do you have any thoughts as to why religion or how religion might play a role in this? In terms of the draw for Hispanics toward Trump this election cycle, especially compared to earlier elections?
Well, I think the question is really nuanced, but I'll give it a try. I do think that some of the main religious actors in these stories about evangelical resilience or the growth of charismatic groups, Pentecostal groups in non-denominational evangelicalism, for instance, are driven by women actors. I mean, it's pretty established in the literature that sometimes the first person that will go to a church, the most avid participant in church life would be the woman / wife / mother, right? So, and often evangelical and charismatic churches, the ones that we're saying are Christian nationalism, also voted for Trump. So keep it all in view. Those churches are frequently organized around family life. So for instance, they'll announce, there's this for the ladies of the church. There's this thing on Tuesday for the fathers, and there's these things for the children. So that's a constant family frame in the church framing and life of the church, right? So you see a lot of female religious agency in choosing these churches. I want to be very clear. They are aware of the religious market. They are aware that there are other kinds of churches. They choose these churches. So the question is, why, right? I think that's one framing that has to be kept in view when we talk about what the men in these churches do. What do Latino Protestant men who vote for Trump, Latino Catholic men who vote for Trump, what are they really voting for when they vote for him? And I would like to suggest there's an alignment here, which is that Christian versions of patriarchy can absolutely be a strategy, very acceptable, even very part of the common cultural life of evangelical churches, both white and Hispanic. And it can be, in fact, no secret at all. I would actually point out that it can be actually a female strategy for organizing family life in a way that makes a husband both responsible and agentive. And there's some really old established literature. The Reformation of Machismo by Elizabeth Brusco looked in Latin America. Why were Catholics in Latin America switching over to Protestantism? And what Brusco found was actually it was women who were switching, and that this religion helped them, Protestantism and actually Pentecostalism, helped transform their macho men into men who were reformed into providers and protectors of the home. I don't think that we are getting very far away from actually describing the motivations of women in evangelical churches states. So when we look at, Melissa, your wonderful analysis of, are women really different from men in their embrace of this kind of two gender ideology and these kinds of roles for organizing home and public life? No, there's a lot of synthesis of their visions for what makes for well-ordered life. And I would just like to note that there's also alignment here. So when we look at Latino Protestant participation in Christian nationalism, because it's such a conundrum, right? Because it kind of confounds the imagination. What Dr. Jones was just mentioning was like the doctrine of discovery. This is a very white, male-centric vision of Christianity. How could it be that Latin Latin American Protestants would participate in this? Well, I was just doing field work in Brazil that I compared to, for instance, research that I do in my own home state of Texas. And there I see a symmetry between how people envision not just their nations, but the world. They understand the world to have a geopolitics that should be organized around Christian influence. There, they can also imagine, for instance, that Brazil or Mexico or the US have roles to play, but among all of these nations that have roles to play, none is more important than Israel. So although in this particular set of data, one Christian nationalist looks like the same as another Christian nationalist, if we're curious about differences between ethnicities, I would like to look at their overall frame for geopolitics, whether actually there might be Zionism informing their viewpoint. And in that scheme, where their nation fits in a kind of global politics that is going to be, yes, favorable to Christian nationalism, but maybe not a one-to-one with the doctrine of discovery that we are just hearing out, which certainly obtains in certain parts of the country.
Well, that's a lot to chew on, Erica. Thank you. I can't believe it's already 1 o'clock. Oh my goodness. This hour has just flown by. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it at that. We had so many good questions. Maybe we'll try to keep those up and think about some of the contributions and questions that our viewers have asked here. But I'd really like to thank again both Sam and Erica for joining us today, Robbie for the great presentation. Also to our research team and comms team who've done a really remarkable job of getting our survey ready and available. But please sign up to our website if you're not, following our news information. But please also take our news and put it on Blue Sky, whatever your social media chains are, just to kind of get some more awareness about this really, really important study. So thank you all again for coming today.